I never imagined that one ordinary night would become the turning point in my life. I was sitting at my desk in our modest two-story home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, working on some code when a strange notification flashed on my laptop. The screen briefly lit up with a message that I couldn't quite place. A few lines of undecipherable text that seemed out of place. My name is Michael Carter, a software engineer who had always trusted logic above all else. But that night, something stirred within me, a hint of unease I couldn't dismiss. I glanced up toward the living room where my wife, Jessica, sat on the sofa, lost in the pages of a mystery novel. Jessica was the steady heartbeat of our home, warm, composed, and always radiating a quiet confidence. Yet as the soft hum of the evening settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the flicker of those few digital characters meant more than mere technical noise. At first, I told myself it was nothing, a glitch in the system, a stray email meant for someone else. After all, in our tech-driven lives, errors and accidental notifications were not uncommon. But as the night deepened, I found my thoughts constantly drawn back to that brief message. I tried to return to my work, tapping at the keyboard, yet every beep and click made my heart beat a little faster. The email was cryptic, void of any clear context. It featured a few nonsensical strings of numbers and letters, and an unknown digital signature that I couldn't trace. I spent a long while trying to dismiss it as a false alarm, rationalizing that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, small things began to add up. Jessica's phone, which usually sat silently on the coffee table, started buzzing late into the night. I noticed her glancing at it with an intensity that was unusual, an intensity that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I began to notice these subtle changes in our routine. Jessica, who had always been punctual with her evenings at home, started spending more time on her phone in secluded corners of our house. She would often step out to take a short walk around the block, leaving me alone with my thoughts. In our perfectly synchronized life, these minor deviations created ripples of uncertainty in my mind. Determined not to let my imagination run wild, I decided to focus on my work. Yet, every time I opened an email or received a text, I couldn't help but scan the screen, half expecting to see a clue that would either confirm or deny my suspicions. The house, usually filled with the comforting sounds of routine, dishes clinking in the sink, the soft murmur of a television, now seemed charged with an undercurrent of secret activity. One Friday evening, I invited a couple of close friends over for dinner at a local diner. The familiar banter and laughter provided a welcome distraction. Mark, a longtime friend with a penchant for conspiracy theories, joked about how digital ghosts could be hiding in the background of our lives, while Susan, ever the optimist, argued that technology was just a tool and nothing more. I forced a laugh, but inside, my mind was racing. As we talked over burgers and milkshakes, my thoughts strayed back to the mysterious email and the strange behavior at home. Yet I made a silent promise to myself to wait for more evidence before drawing any conclusions. That night, when I returned home, the familiar comfort of our living room felt somehow different. Jessica greeted me at the door with a tender kiss on my cheek. Her smile was warm and genuine, yet there was a flicker in her eyes that I couldn't ignore, a glimmer that suggested she had secrets of her own. We exchanged a few pleasantries about our day, and she casually mentioned a brief call she had received earlier in the evening. I nodded along, choosing not to press for details. The unease that had begun to creep in all day was now buried beneath layers of routine conversation and familiar expressions. Later that night, as I lay in bed with the soft hum of the ceiling fan lulling me to sleep, I replayed every moment in my head. The email, her furtive glances at the phone, the sudden need to step out for a walk. It all painted a picture of a life that was no longer entirely open. I resolved to keep my curiosity in check, to gather more information without disrupting the fragile balance of our everyday life. After all, I was a man of logic and evidence, not wild assumptions. In the days that followed, I found myself paying extra attention to every detail. Jessica's morning routines, her interactions on the phone, even the timing of her work-related emails, all became pieces of a puzzle I felt compelled to solve. I began to quietly record these observations on my computer, thinking that patterns could be discerned if I just collected enough data. It wasn't a matter of distrust, it was a matter of protecting the sanctity of what we had built together. During one late afternoon, as I was sifting through logs of our home's internet activity, I noticed an unusual pattern of encrypted messages that had appeared on our shared devices. They were buried deep in system logs, almost as if someone had deliberately hidden them in a routine background process. My heart pounded as I realized that these digital footprints didn't belong to the ordinary ebb and flow of our lives. I tried to rationalize it as a technical anomaly, yet the timing of the messages coincided with those moments when Jessica had left the house for her walks or when her phone was abnormally active. I decided to address it indirectly by asking Jessica about a supposed software update on our devices. Her response was measured and dismissive, but the way she brushed off the inquiry only deepened my uncertainty. I made a mental note to delve deeper into the data later that night, once I had a moment alone with my thoughts. As the week drew to a close, the evidence was subtle but mounting. I wasn't ready to confront Jessica yet. I needed to be certain before I risked shattering the fragile trust between us. I found solace in the routines of my work, yet every time I closed my laptop at the end of the day, I couldn't help but wonder, what was hiding beneath the surface of our carefully constructed life? The digital world, with its encrypted messages and anonymous chatter, was starting to intrude upon the personal sanctuary of our home. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my study reviewing my collected data, I realized that something had irrevocably changed. The email, the mysterious, out-of-place message, had been the spark that ignited a slow-burning investigation. I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination, aware that the truth might not be as simple as I had hoped. Yet I also knew that I could no longer ignore these signs. In a world where information was power, I needed to rely on cold facts rather than emotional guesses. I shut down my laptop and looked around the room, the familiar shadows of home now carrying an unfamiliar weight. I promised myself that I would be vigilant, that I would uncover the truth behind every anomaly and every whispered secret. The balance of our marriage, and perhaps much more, depended on it. As sleep finally overtook me, I drifted into dreams filled with lines of code and elusive shadows, a premonition of the labyrinth of secrets waiting to be unraveled. And though I didn't yet know the full extent of what lay ahead, I was ready to follow the trail, no matter where it might lead. In the days that followed, the subtle anomalies in our routine began to mount. Every morning, as I sipped my coffee in our modest kitchen in Cedar Falls, I found myself replaying fragments of the previous night's unsettling data. The mysterious email, those hidden encrypted logs, and the curious pattern of Jessica's phone activity all formed a quiet background hum that refused to let go. I resolved to gather every piece of evidence, convinced that the truth lay hidden in the details. At work, my mind was not entirely focused on the projects at hand. Instead, I found myself scanning through logs and network traffic with an intensity that surpassed my usual attention to detail. In the secure confines of our shared digital space, I began to notice irregularities. There were bursts of encrypted traffic at odd hours, right when Jessica would step out for her so-called short walks. I made discrete notes on a digital notepad, linking the timestamps with moments when the household was unusually quiet. Jessica's routine, once a comforting predictability, was now punctuated by subtle gaps. Even during her afternoons, when she was supposed to be engaged in her work as a freelance graphic designer, there were inexplicable pauses. Her phone would light up with notifications she would quickly dismiss, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her screen as she hurriedly locked it away. I resisted the urge to ask directly, opting instead for a methodical collection of facts. I needed concrete data, something that could not be dismissed as a fluke or an error. Late one Tuesday evening, while reviewing our home network's activity logs, I stumbled upon a set of unusual entries. The encrypted packets were heavier than normal, and the source IP addresses didn't match any of the usual services we used. They were routed through unfamiliar servers, seemingly hidden behind layers of redirection. My pulse quickened as I tried to piece together the significance. The timings coincided perfectly with the moments Jessica would leave the house, as if the communication was linked directly to her absences. I decided to act discreetly. I set up a schedule to review the network logs more frequently, carefully noting every deviation from our typical digital rhythm. It wasn't long before I noticed a recurring pattern, a digital footprint that pointed toward an external entity I could not immediately identify. There was no overt message, no clear admission of wrongdoing, just a series of data points that didn't belong in the normal course of our everyday lives. The more I observed, the more I began to connect the dots. One afternoon, I returned home a bit earlier than usual and found Jessica in the living room, seemingly engrossed in a conversation on her phone. Her tone was measured, her responses prompt, and yet there was a hesitation, a brief pause that caught my attention. I watched from a distance, careful not to alert her that I was paying attention. I noted her body language, the way she leaned forward slightly, the flicker of an unread message on her screen. It was as if she were waiting for something or someone. That evening, as rain began to tap softly against the window panes, I sat at my desk and reviewed my collected data. The encrypted messages, the unusual IP addresses, and the pattern of Jessica's departures created a mosaic that was slowly revealing a narrative. I remembered the conversation with my friend Mark at the diner, a casual remark about digital ghosts, and it suddenly took on a more ominous tone. The idea that someone might be using the dark recesses of the internet to hide their communications was no longer a mere theory, it was a tangible possibility. Intent on understanding more, I turned to online resources and technical forums that discussed anomalies in network traffic. I learned about sophisticated encryption methods, dark web protocols, and the kind of tactics hackers employ to maintain anonymity. Each article and forum post added another layer to my understanding, yet none provided a definitive link to my situation at home. Still, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture of clandestine communications, ones that had no place in our carefully managed digital life. The next few days brought further developments. On one afternoon, while Jessica was out, attending to a client meeting, I found myself alone in the house with my thoughts and the persistent hum of our network logs. I revisited the timeline of events I had been assembling, comparing her absences with the bursts of encrypted data. The correlation was striking. The digital activity spiked precisely when she was out of the house, long enough to suggest that it was more than a passing anomaly. It felt deliberate. Despite the growing evidence, I remained cautious. I wasn't ready to confront Jessica without incontrovertible proof, and I wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict. Instead, I decided to expand my investigation further into the technical side of things. I began running tests on our network, tracing the origins of the suspicious IP addresses through various anonymizing networks and VPN endpoints. The process was painstaking and time-consuming, yet every discovery deepened the mystery. There was an unmistakable trail, a breadcrumb path left by someone who was careful and calculated. The next evening, as I prepared dinner in our quiet kitchen, I observed Jessica entering the room later than usual. She excused herself briefly, claiming to fetch something from the study, but her hurried manner did little to allay my suspicions. Over the course of the evening, I noted every instance of her discreet phone use and the sporadic silence that followed. The atmosphere in our home, once defined by predictable routines, was now permeated with a sense of calculated secrecy. That night, after Jessica had gone to bed, I set up a temporary monitoring system on our home network. The idea was to capture real-time data on any encrypted exchanges that might occur during the quiet hours of the night. I sat in my study, eyes fixed on the flickering screen, heart steady but mind alert. The logs continued their silent conversation, and as the hours passed, I saw one more spike, a pattern that reaffirmed my growing suspicion. The data was clear. Someone was communicating in ways that bypassed the ordinary channels, and those moments always aligned with Jessica's unexplained absences. I was careful not to jump to conclusions. In a world driven by technology, false positives were a possibility, and paranoia could cloud even the sharpest judgment. Yet the consistency of the evidence left little room for error. I began to document everything meticulously, creating a timeline of events, screenshots of network logs, and notes on every irregularity. This was not about intrusion, it was about uncovering the truth hidden in the routine. As the week drew to a close, the mounting evidence created a silent pressure that I carried with each passing day. Every encrypted packet, every unusual login attempt, and every discreet glance Jessica exchanged with her phone deepened the mystery. The investigation was no longer confined to technical logs and data entries. It had woven itself into the fabric of our daily lives. With a resolve tempered by both determination and the need for concrete proof, I knew that the next step was inevitable. I would have to confront the growing discrepancy between the Jessica I knew and the secrets hidden behind her eyes. Until then, I was content to work in the shadows, methodically piecing together the evidence, waiting for the final clue that would force a confrontation and change the course of our lives forever. As I closed my laptop for the night, the weight of every recorded anomaly and every whispered data point pressed on me. In the dim glow of the study, I made a silent vow: I would uncover the truth, no matter how deep or convoluted it might be. And as sleep claimed me, the persistent hum of the digital world continued its quiet, relentless dialogue, one that promised that nothing in our seemingly perfect life was as it appeared. As the days turned into an uneasy blur of routine and observation, I found myself increasingly entrenched in the labyrinth of digital clues. The data I had gathered was no longer a series of isolated anomalies. It was starting to form a narrative that pointed to a calculated web of deception. My evenings, once filled with the quiet hum of home, were now occupied by the glow of my computer screen, where streams of encrypted messages and suspicious IP addresses laid bare a pattern that I couldn't ignore. One particularly drizzly evening, as the soft patter of rain blended with the steady hum of our network equipment, I sat in my study reviewing the logs collected over the past week. The familiar rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall reminded me that time was passing even as I remained locked in this relentless pursuit. I recalled the precise moments when Jessica's phone buzzed incessantly, instances that perfectly overlapped with the spikes in encrypted traffic. It was no coincidence. Someone was deliberately communicating, and those moments corresponded to her unexplained absences. Driven by a need for deeper understanding, I began cross-referencing the data I had meticulously noted. I compiled a timeline that detailed every instance of irregular network activity, correlating each spike with Jessica's whereabouts. My analysis revealed a startling trend: a consistent burst of encrypted exchanges every time she left our home under vague pretenses. It was as if the digital world was recording a secret conversation that was not meant for my eyes. Late that night, after another long session poring over the data, I decided to push the investigation further. I remembered a few technical forums where cybersecurity experts discussed advanced encryption and anonymization techniques. I spent hours reading posts and discussions, absorbing information about how hackers used multiple layers of encryption to mask their communications. One term kept cropping up: darknet channels. A phrase that hinted at a world where messages were not only hidden, but deliberately obscured. The more I read, the more the possibility that someone from that shadowy realm was involved became undeniable. The turning point came when I discovered a peculiar log file buried deep in our network's history. It wasn't flagged by any standard security software, but it contained a series of messages in a format that I recognized from one of those online discussions. The messages weren't just random. They followed a pattern that suggested a deliberate, ongoing conversation. I spent the next several hours decoding what I could, employing some of the techniques I had just learned. The more I decrypted, the clearer it became that these messages were part of a conversation between two parties, one of whom was likely Jessica. I remember the moment vividly, the clock's minute hand creeping past midnight, the room bathed in the dim light of my monitor, and the sense of both dread and determination settling over me. Each decrypted line hinted at a rendezvous, a meeting, or a planned exchange of information. There were references to secure channels and final instructions, terms that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just an innocent mistake or a harmless flirtation, it was something calculated, orchestrated in the shadows of the internet. The more I pieced together the fragments of these hidden exchanges, the more I began to suspect that Jessica wasn't merely engaging in casual flirtation. Instead, she appeared to be involved in an ongoing relationship that had a technical edge, a connection maintained through encrypted communications, far removed from our everyday interactions. It was as if she had stepped into a clandestine world, one governed by codes and secrecy, where every word and every digital signal was meticulously measured. Even as I wrestled with the implications of this discovery, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of detachment that began to creep over me. The woman I had known for years was slowly revealing herself as someone capable of living a double life, one foot in our familiar world of routine, the other in a realm of digital subterfuge. The idea that she might be involved with someone whose life revolved around the dark corridors of the internet unsettled me deeply. Yet, even in that moment of personal turmoil, I maintained my resolve to uncover every detail. Determined to leave no stone unturned, I decided to trace the origin of the encrypted messages further. I set up a series of controlled tests on our network to simulate the conditions under which the data was being exchanged. Every time Jessica stepped out, I monitored the activity with heightened vigilance, trying to isolate the signature of those covert communications. The tests revealed that the encrypted bursts were not random background noise. They were deliberate, recurring transmissions that emanated from a consistent source, a source that was cloaked behind layers of digital anonymity. At this point, I knew that the next logical step was to identify the external connection. I started compiling a dossier of every IP address and every coded string that appeared in the logs. The work was painstaking, each small discovery adding a piece to the larger puzzle. I reached out to some online communities of cybersecurity enthusiasts, carefully describing the technical aspects without divulging personal details. The responses were mixed. Some offered technical advice, while others warned me of the dangers of probing too deeply into the dark web. But every piece of information reaffirmed what I had come to suspect. Someone with considerable technical prowess was communicating with Jessica. As the days wore on, my internal resolve hardened. I felt a growing urgency to confront the situation, not with an explosive confrontation, but with the clear, cold facts I had amassed. The realization that Jessica was entangled in a network of secret communications began to settle over me like a shroud. I found myself increasingly isolated, the comfortable home I once shared with her now a silent repository of hidden data and unspoken betrayals. In the midst of this internal storm, a particular evening stands out. I had just finished dinner alone. A meal prepared with the usual care but eaten with a heavy heart, and returned to my study to review another set of network logs. The data revealed an even more pronounced spike in encrypted activity that night. It was accompanied by a digital signature that was almost identical to one of the codes I had seen before. I knew then that the person on the other end of these exchanges was not an amateur. This was someone experienced in navigating the digital underground, a figure whose presence loomed large even in the intangible world of data. With every new discovery, the intricate web of deception unraveled further. I began to realize that I was staring into the abyss of a secret life, one where personal boundaries were blurred by the anonymity of the internet. The evidence was mounting, each new piece of digital chatter reaffirming my worst suspicions. The meticulous collection of encrypted messages, timestamps, and IP logs painted a picture that I could no longer ignore. My wife was living a double life, one that was deeply intertwined with the clandestine world of cyber deception. As I prepared to document my findings for what would likely be the ultimate confrontation, I felt the weight of inevitability. The data was irrefutable, and the truth, however painful, was emerging from the shadows. I closed my laptop, the screen still aglow with the remnants of my digital investigation, and allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. In that quiet solitude, I acknowledged that the next steps would force me to confront not only the deception but also the woman I once believed I knew completely. In the silence of that rain-soaked night, I resolved to continue on this path, armed with the cold, hard facts of digital evidence and a determination to face the truth head-on. The digital trail was clear, and now it was time for the personal confrontation that would forever change the course of my life. The confrontation had been inevitable. After weeks of meticulous data collection and a relentless pursuit of every digital breadcrumb, I reached a point where the facts demanded resolution. It was a chilly evening in early winter when I decided that the truth, however painful, had to be faced head-on. I arranged to meet the man behind the encrypted messages in a neutral setting, a quiet, low-lit CAF, in downtown Cedar Falls. My heart pounded with a mix of determination and apprehension as I sat at a secluded booth, scanning the door for any sign of the mysterious correspondent. I knew that once this meeting began, there would be no turning back. Soon enough, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in dark clothing with an unassuming presence, entered the CAF. His eyes were guarded, and there was an air of practiced caution about him, a man who was clearly accustomed to operating in the shadows. He moved directly toward my table. When he reached it, I greeted him with a nod and a measured tone. "Ethan, I'm Michael Carter. We need to talk." He acknowledged my introduction with a slight, almost imperceptible nod before settling into the chair opposite me. For several long minutes, we sat in silence as I spread out the evidence I'd gathered on a small notepad and on my tablet. Screenshots of encrypted logs, timestamps correlating with my wife's unexplained absences, and fragments of decrypted messages that left no doubt about the covert communications. Each piece was laid out like damning testimony. Ethan's expression remained inscrutable. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was cool and detached. "Michael, I never intended to hurt anyone. Jessica reached out to me online. What began as conversations soon escalated beyond the ordinary." His words struck me like a physical blow. I listened, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Explain to me what you mean by beyond the ordinary." My voice was firm, every word measured. Ethan continued, "Our interactions started with encrypted messages and secure channels. I didn't expect things to become as involved as they did. It was never meant to become personal in a destructive way. But once we crossed that line, I was in too deep to just step back." His tone was devoid of remorse, as if the entire affair were merely a transaction, a series of actions without sentiment or moral weight. I pressed further, not out of anger but from a need for clarity. "Do you realize you've torn apart a marriage?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, the CAF's low murmur faded into a tense quiet. Ethan's eyes met mine briefly, then darted away. "I understand the consequences," he said calmly. "Jessica made her choices. I was just a facilitator in a chain of events." Every word he uttered reinforced the reality that I had long suspected. Jessica wasn't a victim of a momentary lapse in judgment. She had consciously stepped into a hidden life. The finality in his tone, the coldness in his delivery, left me with an undeniable truth. This wasn't about an accidental mistake. It was a carefully orchestrated betrayal, conducted under the cloak of digital anonymity. I gathered the evidence close, feeling the weight of every recorded data point and every missed moment of trust. "Then tell me," I said slowly, "what does this mean for us? For my wife? Why keep this secret even now?" I demanded answers, not out of a need for a dramatic explanation, but simply to understand how our lives had veered so far from the ordinary. Ethan shifted in his seat. "For Jessica, it was an escape," he replied simply. "A way to feel something different, to break away from the monotony. I was the antithesis of everything she had in her routine life, someone from the shadows, free from expectations." His voice was clinical, as if discussing business rather than the ruin of a marriage. Anger and hurt warred within me, but I held them in check. I wasn't seeking to exude raw emotion. I was here for the truth, and the truth was as stark as it was bitter. "So what now?" I asked. "Is there any hope for the life I thought I knew?" The question was rhetorical, a bitter acknowledgement of the gulf that now lay between us. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "There's nothing that can undo what's been done. Jessica chose this path, and now you must decide how you want to move forward." His words were final, leaving little room for negotiation. It wasn't his affair that I needed to mend. It was the fractures in my own life that had been caused by secrets and hidden data. Leaving the CAF, I felt the cold bite of winter air on my face, a stark contrast to the heat of my inner turmoil. Every step I took was laden with the knowledge that my marriage had entered a new, irreparable phase. I returned home with a heavy heart and a mind reeling from the implications of the encounter. That night, I sat in our living room, the familiar surroundings now tinged with the unmistakable presence of betrayal. Jessica was there, in the soft glow of the television, but the ease in her eyes had vanished. I waited until the noise of the day subsided, until the silence made it impossible to ignore the distance between us. "Jessica," I began, my voice steady yet cold, "we need to talk." There was no dramatic build-up, just the quiet gravity of two people facing the unvarnished truth. I laid out the evidence before her, the logs, the decrypted messages, and even the details of my meeting with Ethan. Each fact was presented without embellishment, like the hard lines of code in a program I had once mastered. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes, which I had known for years, now held a glimmer of resignation. "Michael," she finally said, her tone subdued, "I never planned for it to go this far." There was no tearful apology, no attempt at emotional repair, only a measured admission that echoed the clinical conversation I'd had with Ethan. The conversation that followed was as quiet as it was devastating. There were no explosive outbursts, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. Instead, we exchanged statements of fact and fragments of regret. Jessica explained that what had started as an escape had become a labyrinth of its own making, a digital existence that was difficult to extricate herself from. I listened, each word chiseling away at the remnants of the life I once knew. In the weeks that followed, our home became a place of careful silence and measured interactions. I took time off work to process the overwhelming sense of betrayal and to figure out my next steps. The investigation that had begun as a search for digital evidence had ended with the collapse of the FA I had built my life around. I realized that the digital world, with its encrypted messages and hidden channels, was as real as any emotion, a force capable of dismantling trust and rewriting destinies. I did not choose to wallow in bitterness, but rather I resolved to rebuild what I could from the wreckage. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with quiet conversations, tentative steps toward forgiveness or separation, and a redefinition of what trust meant in an age where secrets could be locked behind layers of code. The scars of betrayal would remain, but they also served as a reminder of the strength required to confront and overcome hidden deceptions. As winter gave way to spring, I began attending support groups and even started consulting experts on cybersecurity, determined to understand how our digital lives had intersected with our most intimate relationships. I began to write down my experiences, an attempt to piece together the fragments of a shattered trust into a narrative that might help me, and perhaps others, learn to navigate the complex interplay between technology and emotion. In the end, my story did not conclude with a dramatic victory or a cathartic explosion of rage. Instead, it ended in the quiet, relentless march toward healing. I learned that in a world where digital footprints can betray even the deepest of secrets, resilience is found in accepting the truth and taking measured steps forward. The finality of that cold winter night stayed with me, a reminder that every byte of data, every secret message, was a marker of choices made and lives forever altered. I have come to understand that some betrayals do not fit neatly into the narratives we construct. Instead, they demand a hard look at the spaces between our everyday interactions, where the most hidden parts of us reside. This is the story of how a routine life was upended by the silent, coded whispers of betrayal, a story that ends not with clear-cut resolutions but with the slow, ongoing process of rebuilding trust, one careful day at a time. And I had just stepped into a game that was much, much bigger than I ever realized. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.